Now, with that out of the way, it is now my pleasure to officially start the conference with our first panel on animals and agency. And our first speakers are Angie Pepper and Richard Healey. I'm going to briefly introduce the two. Angie Pepper is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Roehampton. She is interested in what we owe to non-human animals as a matter of interspecies justice. And she's written on a wide range of topics, including climate change, global justice, zoos, privacy for animals, political agency in humans and animals, and the importance of non-human animal self-determination, as well as animal rights and multiculturalism. And she's presenting with Rich, who is an associate teaching lecturer in philosophy at UCL. And Rich has published several articles on the normative power of consent. And he's currently working on the topic of normative powers more generally, issues in animal rights, and the nature of interpersonal moral relationships. Rich and Angie, the floor is yours.
So thank you to Raphael and Sean for the invitation, and thank you to everyone here for listening to us speak. Probably before I begin, I should say thank you to all of the lawyers for your patience, because this is very philosophical as a paper. Okay. So today we're going to be talking about Assent and the possibility of interspecies justice. So what I'm going to do is just kind of set up the motivation for this paper and what our objectives are. So Rich and I have written a paper, Interspecies Justice, Agency, Self-Determination and Dissent. And in that paper we were kind of motivated by this thought that some philosophers like Ava Meyer and Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka have, that agency, non-human animal agency, is really normatively significant. And indeed, Donaldson and Kimlicka suggest that respecting animal agency and self-determination is the first principle of interspecies justice. So we were kind of gripped by this thought, and we thought, okay, good, that sounds quite plausible to us. So how exactly is agency normatively significant? And it seemed right to us that animals would have a right to self-determination. So one of the things that we do in the paper is explain why it is that they have this right to self-determination. But we also were puzzled by what that would mean for our interactions with other animals, because it seems to us, and particularly Rich, because he works on the normative power of consent, that many non-human animals are going to lack the capacity to give consent. And if that's true, and they have this right to self-determination, then how can we interact with them in ways that potentially kind of violate their right to self-determination? How can you hold them, touch them, bathe them, play with them? All of these things that in kind of interhuman relations we might kind of seek permission for. It looked like animals wouldn't be able to do this. And so this was the kind of puzzle that we were grappling with in the paper. So the important thing for us was that the approach that we were trying to develop was not abolitionist. It wasn't that the animals can't consent, so we should just not engage with them and kind of exclude them from our communities and not have these kind of close interactions with them. It's also not a welfarist view, right? It really does take agency seriously, and it doesn't kind of focus only on the pleasure and the suffering that animals might experience, right? It really is taking this idea of their agency seriously, irrespective of any harms or pleasures that might come about from that agency. And so we developed an account that would make special interspecies relations between humans and animals possible, where we could hold them, touch them, bathe them, all of these things that are kind of common to typical companion relationships, that could be compatible with their rights to self-determination and therefore compatible with the project of interspecies justice. And so we developed this idea of assent and dissent to kind of do the normative work that consent would usually do in the human case. So that was that project, just to give you a background of where we're going. And today what we want to do is explore the limits of our account. So can these ideas of assent and dissent that we've developed ensure that our relations with other animals are in fact compatible with the demands of justice, right? So that's what we're interested in. Because we've become a little bit worried by some of the claims that we made in the initial paper. So in the initial paper, we made it seem that, you know, as long as you are kind to your companion animal and you enable their agency within that relationship, that there isn't anything wrong with the relationship itself. So our tentative central thesis for today is that while valid assent can make our interactions with animals non-wrongful, like particular interactions and activities non-wrongful, it cannot legitimise the current practices, so the mainstream practices of keeping animals as companions, or making them labour for us, right? So this is our very tentative central thesis. So the outline of the talk. So first of all, Rich is going to talk you through the central claims of our original paper so that we can get our position on the table so that you can kind of see roughly what it is that we're committed to. I'm going to say something about the limits of our view, again, in more detail from what I just said a second ago, about why there might be problems with what assent can and cannot make non-wrongful. And then we're going to look at two examples. So the case of assent in the context of non-human, human-animal companionship, and the case of assent in the context of non-human animal labour. Okay.
Thanks. Okay, so yeah, I've got the exciting and fun job of remembering what we said in this paper, which now seems a long time ago, but in any case, I'll give it my best shot. So, as Angie was saying, we argued in that paper that many non-human animals sometimes have rights to self-determination. What we mean by this is, and I'm going to say a bit more in detail about this in a second, but roughly that in certain domains of action, animals' wills should be regarded as authoritative. So to get the general idea on the table, I have rights of self-determination over my body, and that means that you should respect my will when it comes to matters of my body. You can't touch or interfere with my body against my will, right? That's the kind of general thought behind the idea of rights to self-determination that we claim that animals at least sometimes have. And the reason we think they have these rights is sort of, at least briefly, as follows. So, like us, many non-human animals have significant agential capacities. They have preferences and desires and goals, and they understand the world in various ways, and they act so as to satisfy their desires and goals. And in virtue of these capacities, we think they have significant interests in being able to exert control over their lives and their experiences. Just as it matters to us to be able to exert control over basically how we go about in the world, it seems very plausible that it matters a great deal to them to exert control over their own lived experiences. And we think that this is plausibly for both instrumental and non-instrumental reasons. So insofar as an animal wants to exert control in some domain, interfering with them will harm them and sort of by distressing them or upsetting them. But we also think it's plausible that a component of living a good life for many non-human animals, at least in many domains, will simply be exercising this kind of control. The sort of basic thought is there's something really significant about being an embodied agent who has perceptions of the world and wants to go about in it in a certain way, which means that one has interest in being able to exert this control, and that these interests, at least sometimes, will be sufficient to ground rights that mean that other people shouldn't interfere with the choices that you make in these domains or in these areas. So more specifically, we said, so this was sort of the motivation or the sort of rough argument for why they might have these interests that underpin rights to self-determination. And we said more specifically that an individual non-human animal has a right to self-determination when they have this kind of interest in being self-determining within a certain domain, and that interest is sufficient to put others under duties, relying on a kind of general interest theory of rights. And, importantly, they're sufficiently competent decision maker within a particular sphere of their life or regarding a particular interaction. So it seems an important feature of rights to self-determination that an agent be competent to make decisions regarding that sphere of action if we're going to be treating their will as kind of decisive in determining what we ought to do. Now, as I said, the idea here is that in these kinds of domains of self-determination, an animal or human's will is regarded as normatively authoritative. And to say this is to say that when they communicate their will to us, it doesn't only give us one reason in favour of doing something, but it is, as we describe, borrowing some language from Daniel Grohl, structurally decisive. So here's the intuitive idea. When I go to the doctors and they propose some course of treatment for me, if I say, no, I don't want that to happen, it's not that my saying no is just one consideration for them to take into account, alongside, say, the deleterious effects of whatever illness it is that I have, and then they weigh up whether they should start, interfering with me in the suggested way. The fact that I've said no is decisive, and it serves to exclude other considerations of my well-being from their deciding what to do. Basically, sort of is the end of story, right? And so the thought is, with these kind of rights, the same structure is apparent in each case. When I have the sufficient interest and I'm sufficiently competent, then whatever I communicate is essentially decisive. There are some sort of exceptions that don't really matter, but that's the general story. An important feature of the overall picture is we're not claiming that non-human animals necessarily have the exact same set of rights to self-determination that humans or indeed other animals might have. You can have this right in just some spheres, in many spheres, or perhaps in all spheres of your life. It depends upon your having the sufficient interest and being a competent decision maker. So the claim for us was just that in some cases, like some of the kind of intuitive examples of companionship Angie was mentioning about touching or stroking or bathing or whatever, that animals could have in those contexts rights to self-determination where we should treat what they want as decisive in determining what we do. Okay. So they have rights to self-determination, but like Angie said, there seems to be a problem generally in human interactions, or at least often in human interactions, where we rely upon one another's consent. As I've been talking about the example of going to the doctor, I give or don't give my consent to some kind of interaction, and that determines how the doctor should interact with me, whether it's permissible for them to make an incision or not make that incision. In the case of non-human animals, we suggest in the paper at least that animals, or most non-human animals, will lack the power of consent. Now, the reason for this is not, we think, that in general they won't be sufficiently informed. In fact, the sort of account of rights to self-determination suggests that they can be sufficiently informed, at least in some spheres of action. The problem is that the normative power of consent, at least as it's kind of generally understood now, involves an agent's intending to give someone permission. So it involves our having a understanding that we possess rights and have an ability to waive those rights by engaging in certain kinds of actions. And whilst ultimately it's an empirical question, we speculate that most non-human animals don't have this capacity. They don't have the capacity to understand other people as owing them duties, not to act in certain ways, duties that they might waive by communicating that it's okay for them to do something. So if that's right, it left us in this quandary. How do we think about interacting with non-human animals in the kinds of intuitively, at least sometimes permissible ways from like the companion context and others, if they have sometimes rights to self-determination, but they can't give us consent to the interactions that we engage in? And to try and solve this problem, we suggested that whilst they can't give consent, whilst they can't understand themselves as waiving a right to a certain form of interaction, they can manifest what we call assent and dissent. And the general idea is that assent is the communication of, or the willful affirmation of some interaction or activity, and dissent is the willful, or what should I say?
It'll come up.
The willful refusal, okay, that's a good way of putting it. The willful refusal to engage in some kind of activity. So the ways in which assent and dissent might be manifest is kind of myriad, but the general thought is that if an animal seems happy or pleased or enjoying, or perhaps not strongly resisting or kind of sufficiently putting up with, then we can take them, depending on the stakes involved, to be assenting to some interaction, being brushed, being stroked, etc. And if they're hiding, looking disgruntled, upset, going away, then we should take that activity as signs of dissent, and we should regard, carrying on with that interaction as impermissible. Did you want to add anything about?
Yeah, so I guess that it's important that in the case of valid assent that it's not a product of coercion, right? It has to be freely given. And the reason why I wanted to kind of make sure that the passive mode of assent is there is because I think that, for example, in the case of children and companion dogs, right, the dogs often will put up with quite a lot. They tolerate it. They're not particularly enthusiastic about having their ears pulled, but they might, be perfectly happy to assent to that kind of interaction. So I think that there are interactions between humans and animals where the assent is not so much enthusiastic but passive and kind of represents a sort of form of tolerance towards humans. It doesn't have to be, assent doesn't have to be kind of coupled with enthusiasm, I guess is the basic thought there. Is that?
Yep, over to you,
I
think.
Okay. Good. So now we're just going to say something about the limits of this account. So we sketched this account and then we were like, it's all fine now, we can all go and hang out with our companion animals, and as long as we're respecting their assent and dissent, this is all perfectly compatible with the project of interspecies justice. So as I said, we typically in the paper focused on interpersonal relationships between humans and non-human animal companions, and I think that there's something telling in that, right, that was the focus. And I think that, to be upfront, the paper was motivated by our experience of a kind of stray cat who basically just moved in with us, and we were really uncertain about how to negotiate this relationship with him, and so we started writing this paper. And so a lot of what's going on in here is informed by that very unique context of an animal who's choosing, right, to kind of come and be in your home. And then, for example, he had a serious injury and we needed to take him to the vet, and that meant that he had to be confined for a couple of weeks, which he was very unhappy about, and we were kind of constantly negotiating how to deal with him in this situation. And so that experience is really motivating a lot of what is going on in this paper, but it's quite a unique experience. So as I said, or as we've said, assent can make interactions, particular interactions within the relationship, non-wrongful. So if you've sought the assent of your animal companion, then it looks like, and you've respected their dissent, then it looks like you are not acting wrongfully with regard to them in those interactions. But we had a footnote in the paper that was scrapped, probably for reasons of space, although now we can't remember why it was scrapped, that I think is actually quite insightful. So we were talking about, we had this footnote which talked about the context of medical research involving non-human animals, and I was thinking that it might be possible that the relationship between an individual researcher and the animals who were the research subjects, interactions within that relationship might be non-wrongful if the researcher seeks assent and dissent, right? So assuming that the particular interaction was not harmful, so let's say, I don't know, taking the temperature of an animal, right? Doesn't, or holding them for some reason. If assent and dissent was respected, it seemed to me at least that the relationship between that individual human and animal might be kind of less morally bad in some way, right? It was that animal researcher would be more morally decent because they had respected the assent and the dissent of the animal in question. But importantly, in the footnote, we said that even if an individual animal could assent to particular interactions or procedures within that context, it wouldn't make the whole thing okay, right? They can't assent to being a research subject. They can't assent to being kind of confined and used in that way. So already there we're noting that what the limits of assent are, right? That it might make these sort of interpersonal interactions non-wrongful, even in a really wrongful context, but that it couldn't legitimate using animals for research. So anyway, that footnote didn't make it into the paper, but now I've started to think that actually many more of our interpersonal human-animal relationships might be like the one I've just described, right? So in the case of companion animals, it's true that like you can do quite a lot to make your interactions with your companion animal non-wrongful by respecting their assent and dissent and enabling their capacities for assent. But actually all of that is likely to be taking place in the context of an unjust relationship, or even if not, we're not sure whether that's the right way to describe it, or at least a deeply morally problematic relationship. So valid assent, as this is kind of what the central thesis promised, it seems to us, whilst it can make the individual interactions non-wrongful, it cannot legitimise the relationships and practices and institutions in which those individual interactions and activities take place, right? That's the key thought here. And the reason for that is that animals are not going to be able, it seems, and again, this is an empirical question, so the usual caveat applies. You can go away and find out whether they can have access to this information. But it seems that a lot of the time their assent is going to depend on them having the information available to them to make decisions and the competence to make decisions about whether or not they participate in these relationships, institutions and practices. Right? So in order to have just interspecies relationships of those kind of higher level kinds, there needs to be assent to those relationships. And in order for there to be assent to those relationships, the animals themselves need to have the information to make a decision about whether to be in those relationships and the competence to make that kind of decision. And so now we're going to look at two cases to see whether it's possible, right? Is there any space, right, in which they might be able to assent to these kinds of relationships?
So, firstly, we're going to say a little bit about the example we've been focusing on, mostly focused on in the paper, non-human human animal companionship. And so, as we've been saying, it looks like for some particular interactions it might do important work. The question is, can it make it permissible to keep animals as companions in general? Where I guess there's sort of actually two questions here. One is, particularly, can I keep a particular animal as my companion, and generally the practice of keeping animals as companions. Obviously, it's more suited to the former question. And the important sort of basic thought, which Angie was just explaining, is that it seems, again, it's an empirical question, but plausible to think that most non-human animal companions or possible companions will lack the information and the competence necessary to assent to being in a human, non-human companion relationship, at least as that's currently understood and practiced, right? So if I went to the dog shelter to get myself a dog companion, they couldn't understand that by sort of acting pleased around me or happy to be around me, that they were assenting to now coming to live in my house, like for the foreseeable future, and engaging in my way of living, even if I tried to be receptive, right, on a day-to-day basis to their assent and dissent about specific things, like going for walks or when they're fed. They never were able to agree to come and live with me and basically have their lives determined more or less by me. So it looks like even if there is some justification for my doing that in sort of getting the dog from the shelter and living with them and trying to give them a good life, we can't think that it's legitimated by the fact that they assented to living with me and being in this kind of ongoing, quite thick relationship where I have a significant amount of power over them. An important part of this is, so they don't have the kind of information and competence necessary, that's the speculation, but we don't think that we can aggregate from all the particular instances of assent that they might give in their life with us to thinking that they're assenting to the overall sort of practice or relationship of living with us, right? So the fact that they mostly assent to, or the fact that say I'm very receptive to when they assent and dissent to go for a walk now or later, or be out in the garden or inside and so on and so forth, that in itself isn't assenting to living with me and again being in this ongoing relationship. So it looks like, insofar as the question is, can it legitimize keeping them as companions or keeping particular animals as companions? No, it can't. Now, one might sort of push back and say, well, insofar as you're saying they're not competent in this area, it looks like they don't have a right to self-determination, because recall on our account, to have a right to self-determination, one of the conditions is that you be competent decision maker in this area. So the fact that they lack a right in this area, or with regard to this decision of living with a particular companion, you might think, might undermine the problem here. One sort of obvious kind of thought is that just because they don't have a right to self-determination, it doesn't mean that we can sort of be bringing them into existence to live with us as companions, or even those that are already in existence, sort of bring them into our homes to live with us for the rest of their lives. There's also, though, I think we want to suggest a kind of middle position here, and this is where perhaps the boundaries of our current understanding of things are going to become increasingly apparent. Whilst we think that they can't ever give the kind of global assent to being part of a companion relationship, it seems plausible to us that at least some animals do have strong interest in being self-determining about the extent to which they live in certain kinds of companion relationships, and could give meaningful assent or dissent to doing so if their agency was enabled in various ways. So I guess, but importantly, this would require quite a radical shift in how we think about and model relationships between humans and companion animals. The rough thought, I think, is something like we could have a system whereby dogs were able to freely come and go between our houses or something like that. So that whilst they were never fully assenting to the sort of participation in a companion or some companion relationships, they would be able to be like, well, Rich is really annoying, I'm not going to stay around his house today, I'm going to go out to the park or go to another house where I sometimes spend time with other companions, and so on and so forth. And we think that, well, for animals where this is a possibility, we at least need to think about enabling their agency to make this a reality, at least for those animals who already exist. So what does what I've been saying mean for keeping animals and companions? It's a bit unclear, I think, but there are now two categories. We've got animals who can't assent to companionship or don't have the capacity to assent to companionship in any form. So let me just sort of stipulate that mice will never be able to even have the kind of mid-level ability to assent that I was just gesturing at. No? Yeah,
Oh, I know, sure. I think the basic point is that there might be some... So one thing is that we don't know which animals might constitutionally not have the competence, right? We just don't know that. But if there are some animals who just don't have that capacity, it doesn't matter how you try to enable it for them, right? Then this is like what we would say about those animals. But we just don't know which animals they might be, right, because of the way that we currently treat them.
So then for those animals, we should take care of those that exist and respect their rights to self-determination where they do have them. This leaves open the question of, the general practice of keeping them as companions into the future, bringing them into existence, and so forth. We don't know what to say about that, but we at least want to say no support is given to the legitimation of the practice from the fact that we can, in certain ways, respect animal agency. I guess that's the kind of take home from where we started, right? And then there's this kind of there's this case where there are at least some nascent capacities for higher levels of assent to participate or not participate in certain interactions and relationships. Here, like I suggested, we think that we need a radical restructuring of the practices of domestication and companionship so as to enable these forms of agency and give them this ability to make more decisions about their own lives. But again, this leaves quite open and in no way offers support to the thought that even the fact that they could assent or dissent to being with me today, Angie tomorrow, someone else on another day, doesn't necessarily support the practice of keeping them within this system or having them be our companions within such a system.
I think that in a radically remodeled system, you might think that, at least intuitively, and this is unfounded, just have a hunch, it seems to me less wrongful to bring animals into existence who might then have the choice of being our companions or not, right? So just like you have children, you bring them into the world. If you think that's fine and they go and live their lives, then it seems to me analogous that you might bring animals into existence or allow them to bring one another into existence, and that some of those animals might choose to be companions. But in the former case, where they're animals who are constitutionally unable to live, but to be free, to make kind of voluntary and freely informed choices about who to be companions with, right? So their lives are very heavily structured and they're very dependent in that way. I'm less sure. They have a kind of, it's like they have a diminished capacity for self-determination, and I wonder about whether or not there's a problem with bringing those animals into existence, which is a problem from the point of view of self-determination. So it's not about other harms that might be done to that animal in question. But we're just not really sure about these future animals and how to think about them. So I think that we're almost out of time. Should I wrap it up there or carry on?
Depends on how many more slides.
Only a few. So okay. All right, thank you. Okay, so just the final section. So I just want to say something about assent and non-human animal labour. We were kind of thinking about the work of Charlotte Blattner, and so Charlotte is a bit more kind of open to the possibility that something like assent, or on her view embodied consent, might make animal labour morally permissible under very, very certain circumstances. So it's not to say that anything like the existing practices would be permissible, but if you could, if animals could give embodied consent, then it might make animal labour permissible. And so we were wondering whether we kind of agreed with this. Do we think that assent, as we've sketched, it can make it permissible to make animals labour to satisfy human ends? I should say that I'm sort of quite suspicious of this. I'm not sure that it can. We think that animals are unable, just as in the case of companionship, to give assent to their occupation, right, to a particular role, including all of the training and the responsibilities that are attached to that. So whilst it might be the case that you can get an assent within particular interactions, it's not the case that an animal can understand, right, that they're adopting a role, a particular occupation. So since a dog, for instance, cannot comprehend what it means to be a therapy dog or a search and rescue dog, this would suggest that humans can't seek assent from dogs to work as therapy animals or as search and rescue animals, right? Because they just can't understand what it is that you're asking of them, right? You can't give them information about those roles, and they can't make choices about the roles themselves. So, for example, while therapy animals may assent to accompanying humans in outside spaces and being petted and playing, they cannot assent to being in the position where someone is likely to place a large emotional burden on them, right? That's not the thing that they're assenting to. They're not assenting to the role and all of the potential responsibilities that come with being in that role. They're only ever assenting to the particular interactions. So again, I'm a bit suspicious of whether assent can do this work in the context of animal labour. So just to reiterate, we think that on our account, yes, it can make workplace interactions and activities non-wrongful. So that just means that where there's a particular human working with a particular animal and they respect their assent and their dissent, then they don't act wrongly towards that animal. But we don't think that it can make the assent, or those instances of assent, can make it permissible for humans to enlist or like source animals to perform labour to satisfy human determined ends, right? So I just don't think that it can play that legitimising role. Now you might say, well, can't we make assent valid in these cases just by giving animals choice, right? So if you give an animal lots of choice over the potential roles that they might take up, then they could pick or choose what they want to be in life. But we think that this is very hard to see exactly how this will work. And in a way, it's a bit like how Rich described going to the animal shelter. Because from the animal's point of view, they don't really know, it's like, try this thing out. Oh, that's great. We'll try this thing out. That's great too. But they're never, ever assenting to the entire package, right, of taking on a particular role. So again, we're not sure that having choice in this context can really legitimate using animals to labour for human ends. Have you got anything to add to that? Because I feel like you...
No, so, no.
Okay, all right, well, let's just leave it brief. Okay, so just lastly, to conclude, so in this talk, hopefully we have set out our account of non-human animal assent, and we've explained to you why and when it's normatively transformative. And we've also suggested that the possibility of assent, so the possibility of getting valid assent in the context of animal companionship, is just going to require a massive remodelling of the current practice. And we've also suggested, albeit rather briefly, that assent cannot legitimise the majority of animal labour practices because animals just do not have the capacity to make judgments about what occupations and roles they want to take on. And that is the end. Thank you.